welcome Susan Morrow from Salesforce, probably the leading platform, as it were, around brand management, engagement, recruiting, and Jeff Korb from Traction on Demand, a partner with Salesforce that builds on that platform and has some great examples of how you effectively do that. So Susan, I'd like to kick it off with you. There's a lot going on at Salesforce these days. That's a lot going on, period, a lot that's relevant to education. So let's start there and make sure the audience understands how you have invested in the higher ed marketing community.
And really quick, just before Susan goes, I did put a Quiller out there so you can see some of the information that they about them and so forth. And both Curtis and Anita, thank you for the time, and it's always thoughtful. And yeah, let's do some more sessions together. And Susan, welcome.
Thanks, everybody. And it's actually great to follow the conversation that just happened in terms of both brand and also the relationship that we maintain with all of the stakeholders in the university. And I think it's a really good transition, in fact, for Salesforce. And so I don't want to assume everybody understands what Salesforce does in education. So a little bit of a primer. Salesforce is known as the #1 CRM in the world. Well, that's customer relationship management. It could as well be constituent relationship management. And years ago, Salesforce decided that they wanted to be able to focus and better serve higher education. People were using Salesforce anyway. So Salesforce had a journey around serving education specifically. The first thing that happened was establishing a data architecture. And data, I hope, is actually something that we come back to and talk about a lot, because it's very important for a number of the things that we want to be able to achieve as an industry in terms of transformation and really serving students. So first step, a data architecture is a way of taking everything that Salesforce has done for commercial and enterprise use and translating it to the typical ecosystem that you find in higher education. And by the way, also in K-12. So that was the first journey really for Salesforce. Next, people started looking at, well, how do you use these commercial products together for education? So that involved both kind of the flow of data, but also repurposing things. For example, there are universities that use our Commerce Cloud as a storefront for executive education. I thought about that. There's a lot of universities that use Marketing Cloud from Salesforce to run all of their communications. These are very similar to commercial applications, but they're for universities. The next part of evolution for Salesforce, and this is what I work on, is purpose-built product. So here we're building products on top of a Salesforce series of platforms, really, specifically to serve the problems of education. And that involves a lot of things. Our first product focused exactly on relationship management. That is advising and the holistic relationship that is important for student success. So Salesforce Advisor Link, one of the first products that we released just last fall, we released another product called Admissions Connect that focuses same power of Salesforce towards recruiting and admissions. So these are purposefully built. They are built on Salesforce Service Cloud, and there's a lot that goes to that in terms of what the capabilities of those products are. So, you know, there's these purpose-built products, there's leveraging the platform capabilities, and then there's more because Salesforce has acquired Tableau. Tableau is now a Salesforce company, and of course, Tableau is very frequently used in higher education. We have an integration software, MuleSoft. Integration is going to be and is a huge issue in terms of the challenges for technology and education. We have AI predictability with a product we call Einstein. These things run throughout all of our products. It gives you this capability, and we've announced intentions to acquire Slack. Slack has been, and I haven't heard conversation yet, but the use of Slack in education tells us an awful lot about where the needs are, what's new, what's different. I've seen some really innovative use, exciting use of that tool that I think points to a lot of where we could go for the future. Finally, one last thought about this, and I'll go back to my point on data. Learner records, digital credentials. What does the world need in order for that to actually happen? That is certainly a big focus as well of Salesforce. And finally, kind of the wrapper on all of this is because we're a commercial platform, because we are in and of itself a software ecosystem, we have very vital relationships with implementers and with ISVs. So I know I have one of our really valued partners here, Traction on Demand, who's going to talk about like what that means to innovate within an ecosystem and what it means to innovate in a commercial ecosystem like Salesforce, but for a very specific set of needs, customers, industries, and markets.
That's thank you, Susan. That's a great cut over. I think you just asked the question. So Jeff, what how do you deliver services on the platform? Accelerate adoption, show that value, and then how does that drive your strategy at Traction on Demand?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I think that the power of the platform, I think, can't be understated. The idea that you have to begin with a strong technology backbone that you are able to build upon. And as Susan mentioned, she and the team at Salesforce have built purpose-built applications to solve and address certain challenges in the student lifecycle, opportunities in those spaces. We at Traction on Demand have extended those products or wrapped around them with certain capabilities, and in other places we've built our own solutions. Susan mentioned also the series of clouds that Salesforce has, right? So the sales and service, and on to marketing and commerce and so on, and all of that kind of lumped together gives SIs like us, we're also an ISV, but an SI like us, the opportunity to cobble these things together in creative ways to solve a series of problems with or challenges within an institution, right? So the fact that there are many ISVs like us in the ecosystem, there's a rich set of products and tools that are being built. So there's a whole lot of we don't all have to reinvent the wheel when it comes to, say, document creation or signing or forms generation or things like that. There's plenty of tools that are available to do those sorts of things, and they plug right into the core platform on which we're building out solutions. So you can't really understate how pivotal it is to have that kind of common underpinning, rather than what I'm used to, frankly, in my background previously, of lots of integrated systems that we go out and we grab a best of breed type solution, which will serve a particular purpose really well, but it becomes this island of data and this island of users, and it's an island, right? The idea of the platform being that we can actually extend this across the entire institution through all of the points around the student life cycle, integrate in the systems that are going to add context and data and relevancy, and then be able to build a view of the student that everyone can share and use to benefit the student. So it's been a huge the capabilities of a platform like Salesforce, I think, are really phenomenal, because there is so much richness and so many participants. To add, the institution themselves becomes a member. I mean, not just a customer in that ecosystem, but a co-creator, right? Whether it's co-creating with Salesforce in the development of product, or a co-creator with Traction on Demand in our development of product, delivery of service, combination of the two. It's a very collaborative and cooperative environment.
Okay, yeah, and I mean, I agree. It's transitioning the community ethos in higher education to taking advantage of a commercial platform, I think, to me is a key, at least for a great many of the institutions that don't have the wherewithal of the research or Ivy League colleges. But notable to me is you come relatively recently as a practitioner running enterprise applications across based on my interactions in the past, a complex ecosystem and set of operating mandates. And now you're focusing on building out in the platform, and you're saying, this platform, in some respects, platform first, solution second. So why should campuses take this enterprise approach to engagement and service delivery instead of going with the best of breed? And Lou mentioned earlier about using Slate, et cetera. You've been on both sides. So can you talk a little bit about why that makes sense from a strategic standpoint?
Yeah, I'm happy to, and I touched briefly on it in these past remarks here, that the point solutions are really good at creating another data silo, right? And even based on the conversations we've been having throughout the day, the last one as well, the idea of student as customer, right? Students are increasing, no matter what kind of student, the average student, typical student, the lifelong learner, the undergraduate, the graduate, whomever, right? They're consumers, they're customers of the institution. And they have expectations as consumers in terms of interacting with the university as a brand and a service provider and so on. And that we tend to fall short of meeting those expectations as we use these point solutions, as we send the student from one system to another, as we as providers of services to the students go from one system to the other. Maybe they're integrated, maybe they're not, maybe loosely, maybe, maybe, right? But we rarely have that, that heralded, whether we call it the 360-degree view of the student or whatever we want to call, rarely do we have those opportunities to see as much as we can around the student so that we can provide the best possible student with the full context, best possible services to the student with a full context of information in terms of the way that the student has interacted with the university or the university is interacting with the student. Point solutions give us way too much opportunity to have that data in a silo, not extend it into a view that everyone can use. So, think of the typical advising solutions of the past, not the advisor link solution of today in Salesforce, but the old, it was over here. We were pumping data in from the SIS. The only people who ever got to use it was the advisor, and the advisor still had to use that and 3 other systems in order to understand what they're enrolled in, what meal plan they use, what dorm they live in, and all of this, that, and the other thing. The idea that we can bring all that together into one place and service the student well is particularly compelling. Now layer into that the idea that, and we talked about this in a prior session as well, the information overload and communications, right? How do we get really targeted communications to the student rather than far too many mass broadcasts that may or may not be relevant to them? Well, platforms are enabling this. The marketing capabilities that will go on top of a platform enable this. So it's really a kind of the ecosystem, again, kind of reinforcing that point, has created a whole lot of opportunity to string things together to solve these problems, bring data together, rather than having yet another series of systems, different technologies, of course, and which one are we hosting in that cloud? What's our security footprint? There's a ton of opportunity to reduce the complexity of the operating environment when we start thinking about how to bring things and unify them on a single platform.
Yeah, so that makes sense, but I think so. Let's flip that over. Kind of mirrors a discussion we had earlier about adopting standards, and because the reality is institutions are full of mandates, and they're either mandates from, they can be local, they can be state level, they can be federal. The vendor may or may not have the time to respond to it. It can be a once, hopefully in a lifetime event like COVID, or an opportunity that has to be pursued for revenue or something else. So the idea that institutions aren't going to need to innovate, they'll just be able to take vendor products, cloud-based or otherwise, and is just unrealistic, in my humble opinion. And I think when people, I think a lot of people, when they look at platforms and say, well, that's actually going to put constraints on my ability to innovate beyond the solution or collaborate with my colleagues because I'm on this platform. And so what do you think about that? How, flip it back on me. How is either one of you adopting a platform? How does that accelerate innovation and building out this ecosystem? And examples would be great if you could bring them to the table.
I'll just take a quick pass and then hand it over to Susan. But one of the things I think has been the best example of that is a response to COVID, right? When we all needed to close our campuses or reopen our campuses, and we needed some technology to track something about our students, whether it was testing status, contact tracing, whatever it may be. Higher ed wasn't able to do what it's used to doing, which is enable gaze, look at our peers, reach out through every mailing list we've got to figure out what are you doing, which product can we buy. There weren't products to buy. Everyone had to go and build in a place that was a comfort zone, right? And we saw, I don't know what, Susan, dozens, hundreds, I don't know what the number is, but a lot of customers within Salesforce ecosystem who said, I've got this platform right here. I can whip up an application that's going to enable me to do A, B, or C very, very quickly. And we saw tons of institutions who were able to do that. I think that's probably the best example of, that kind of agility and the ability to use a platform to respond to that sort of immediate need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that there's a bigger theme there too. When you are a publicly traded company and you are responding to markets, you have to respond at the speed of the market. And so a company like Salesforce, large platform companies have a lot of resources and they move very, very quickly. So at Salesforce, for example, we built work.com, which is an entire solution for managing the employee experience post COVID, during COVID, everything related to it. Yes, that was built with commercial customers in mind, but we also turned it right around and used it for University of Kentucky, which used it for everything to reintroduce and reopen its campus. That happened in a matter, like we built a full set of software solutions in about 2 months. The pace of innovation is quite extraordinary when you're looking at that commercial market. And I want to speak to that for a minute because there's pros and cons of that. And there's pros and cons of thinking like a business. And I also caught that conversation earlier this morning around the business of education. One thing I would say is that our real business is in service to students and what it is that they're looking for in terms of education and being able to serve them and serve them quickly. And the lesson that we get when we follow commercial patterns is that things do move quickly and they also have been proven out. So some of the things that we can do, for example, because we have this commercially oriented innovation R&D engine, is that a lot of things come free for platforms. We are constantly innovating. The work just with artificial intelligence, blockchain, like all of these things that you might hear about in, as they're kind of nice to have. Well, things are built into our platform. Chatbots, I actually was in industry at a time when I was evaluating chatbots in higher ed and all the different companies and all the different startups. Well, chatbot is it's a giveaway within our platform. We have chatbot technology that you don't pay extra for. You can simply enable it. That's because it's a platform. So there are all of these strengths that come with this in terms of technology and innovation. Another thing, though, is that when you operate at a platform that is this large, when you have so many different pieces of complex software, you have to pay a lot of attention to data standards and data models. And the reason that matters is because when we go back to the mission of what we're doing in education and who we serve, when we look at why things don't work, why it is that the majority of students, for example, who enroll to get a 4-year degree don't, not within 4 years, not within 6 years. When we look at that, we try to understand what the issues are, and there's a bunch of great research on this. One thing I'll point out is that we're stalled from data at pretty much every stage in terms of tracking and understanding what's happening to students. So you mentioned point solutions. Let me put a fine point on that. Think about how much information we collect from students during an application process. It's a lot. How much does an advising team know about what came in through admissions? All of that insight around the entire holistic view of the student that you want to determine if they should join your class, does that information flow through? Are you able to actually take advantage of that to make sure that they have better outcomes or intervention if it's needed? Well, the reason that there are these silos is partly about the software that we're implementing. We're implementing software for a functional department need. We're not implementing software to track what we're actually here for, which is ultimately learning and outcomes and the success of these students. So that's a very specific example. For us at Salesforce, we've been focused on the student success experience, which starts in admissions. And that information does need to flow all the way through. And again, that is just something you have to do when you work on a platform as opposed to individual solutions. You have to assume that information that starts at one point in the cycle needs to move all the way through to the end of the cycle, that you need to analyze, derive insights, and visualize that data so that you can take action quickly. And I think that that is a desperately needed capability in education. We need to understand who we fail, why we fail them, where that failure happens, and then fix it quickly. And that's the speed of commercial innovation for software that we need to really leverage in education.
Excellent. So it looks like we have a couple of questions, although I would, if you can, fit in anything that you're free to talk about in terms of what might be coming next. and either with the higher ed community or the products. But let's give Carla a chance to ask her question, and then Matt, you can have the last word maybe.
Well, I'm just interested in understanding how Salesforce can help higher education go across the, I'm going to call it the entire life cycle, because I am also the director of the college and the school's dual enrollment program. And so I take a little bit of, it starts with admissions, actually starts very much pre-admissions. And I've been on your website kind of looking as you've been talking, and I'm like, I don't understand how, I remember the sales pitch in 1998, 99, or even before that, when we were talking about moving to enterprise. I didn't understand how this enterprise platform is any different than what higher education invested in 20 some years ago, when I was a pretty young person coming into this. So help me understand how this helps us go to this next thing of really birth through lifelong learning on a particular platform.
I'm not quite sure what your question is. I mean, I can certainly tell you about a lot of institutions that have used Salesforce successfully throughout both. Well, okay, let me take the idea of a student journey. There's a commercial example that we should be thinking about in higher education, where you're tracking the journey, to your point, of before you ever hit admissions. Well, actually, where do you get information as a student? How do you center that communication towards them? How do you get them the resources that they need in order to consider admissions, as well as helping them through that process to apply, and then to enroll, and then to be successful? Well, part of that means that you have an ability to understand and see a full view of that student across all of those pieces. That is relationship management. That is actually what CRM software does, is it provides a view of every one of those single touch points, and then connects that to intelligent analysis around, well, if that then, right? You can have that kind of logic. You can also have we have this pattern here. So an example of this is within our advising product. We have a concept of success plans. So one thing we know that the first term for a student has all kinds of meaning, right? If they fail their first exam, if they fail a gen ed course, if they're in certain types of categories, they very likely need intervention right then, or they aren't going to graduate. Well, you can build a whole success plan around that. You can build a whole series of interventions anticipating and being able to serve certain groups of students. You can do that because there is software and a platform to do that. And I'm contrasting this with unique point solutions or things you could build custom. The other big point here too is scale. So much of the things that we have implemented where you see great success in terms of outcomes and really serving different groups comes down to bespoke solutions, which is wonderful and expensive and not actually scalable to the needs that we really need to be able to serve. So all of these come back to why technology specifically plays a role. Now, I'm not sure if that answered your question, because I was trying to figure out like what exactly you were asking. I mean, I also heard a little bit about the product marketing on our site and that it didn't make sense to you, but that's, I think, different than what the capabilities would be.
Well, I think what's different, and just, I don't want to take all the time, is that this is a very specific platform. Those of us in higher education are really trying to work through the entire educational pipeline, cradle to grave. And I work with high schools, and my students are coming into the higher education through the high schools. And if that high school isn't using Salesforce, then I'm like, how does this product help me? Because they're coming into higher education way before the admissions process. And so I was just interested, and we're back to talking to an enterprise solution, which I just remember from the late 90s. And so I'm hearing some things that I heard a long time ago, and I'm trying to figure out how, it's 2021. And
well, no, let me speak directly to that issue, having run an admissions department. And one of the things you need to look at admissions is your pipeline and your yield and your average cost for acquisition of a student, as well as your likelihood of being able to recruit students that you know will ultimately be successful in your institution. Everything I just described has to do with, like, what do you understand about the students that are coming in? Now, we actually serve high schools too. We serve districts and with our software, but let's assume that you didn't. Let's assume you were using enterprise, to your point, enterprise software for higher education admissions. Well, what you can do with that is it's similar to Do you walk into a sales experience and know nothing and they know nothing about you and it's over? Or do you have some kind of legitimate connection that you can then draw upon? Like, is it a single step transaction? Is it multi-step? Can you anticipate what that student may need because you've seen so many other students like that? Can you drive down the cost of serving and building that entire admissions office so that you can use those funds in other places? I mean, all of these things they're enabled through software. I think the term enterprise, what's important about that is that it means we're thinking about all of the different institutions. And in higher education, we often have territorial battles between different departments who want to control their own thing. Well, guess what? That happens in the commercial world too. Every large company has politics. Like that is true. But when you have enterprise software, you can leverage things across. And that's the promise. Now, it doesn't always happen that way, and it does take a deliberate focus. But the point of enterprise versus small bespoke solutions is scale, it's movement and freedom of data, and it is the ability to actually analyze and have a data-driven analysis of what's happening and to be able to intervene before the failures happen. And I'm sure I am with many of you that the analysis of like why we failed and why so many students are unsuccessful, while it's interesting and we should learn from it, I would much rather fix that before it happens. There are far too many students that are failed all the way along that process, even during the admissions process. And what I would say and ask is, how do we know how to fix that if we're not looking at data and the relationship between what's actually happening there? You can't solve it on a one-off basis. You need actually the power of having lots of information and insight and being able to intervene before it happens.
So Matt, did you have any last words there?
Yeah, and I think on this we could probably just dive a little bit because I think a lot of people will have the same feeling Carla's having. We've lived through this pain, right? We understand the promises of technology and infrastructure and everything else. Oh, we're going to get reporting, and there's no reporting. The reason is there's no reporting because that product doesn't have the right integration to that information from a high school, right? So when we think about one product, and Carla, see if I'm getting to your question. What it comes down to, and I was listening to this, is you have to do a design thinking because, Susan, you talked about the journey. Well, you talked about it in the Salesforce journey. So the Salesforce journey is inside of the student body element for the most part. In that journey, there's moments that matter that has nothing to do with Salesforce. It's not there. It is sitting in another environment, another system, not because Salesforce can't do it. It's just that's the way these schools are built. They've been designed that way. So the question is, and this goes back, I think this conference is kind of cool because we're getting to design thinking, managing data, leveraging systems like Salesforce to manage it. But I don't think it's a one size, I got the system and I'm going to do how to trigger. I'm a big fan of Salesforce. I'm a big fan of Salesforce, and I don't get any stock. I have nothing in there, but I like what it does because it allows us to trigger, it allows us to look at the student journey, allows us to communicate all the things that I told you my daughter needed to see. I think a CRM like that works really well. Now, I don't think it's a data lake of any sort. And I think there's that decision that needs to be designed where Salesforce, the design that you do through that design thinking has to populate that data lake. That data lake has to allow you to take that data and do the right things that Salesforce designs. That's my view on it, Carla. Like, I get it because even after the student, there's no Salesforce, right? There's things that in alumni, we're going to use the alumni products that may not be in a Salesforce ecosystem. It might be in a totally different realm. So that was what I wanted to, I actually just rose my hand because I'm like, oh, data, design thinking, build your data, use your products well together. That was what I wanted to come back down to. Carla, let me know if that made a little bit more sense. Okay. All right, cool.
If I can chime in on that, Matt, for, as I was thinking of Carla's question, taking a different spin on it was what's different now than 20 years ago when we heard these same promises. And I think one of the differences that I've always pinned when I started my career in higher ed at Hopkins, the systems were all about transactions, right? It was implementing 3-letter symbol for for finance and HCM. It was implementing a student solution. It was implementing systems that were about transaction and system of record, right? And we've all watched in that 10, 15, 20-year period the evolution of the Gartner pace layers, or whichever model you want to refer to, and start adding in systems of engagement, innovation, and so on, right? And the CRM had come into industry at large and then eventually leaked into higher ed to be this new technology that does something different than the old ones did. The old ones made sure that we had a good accounting of what's your student account, what grades did you get, can I give you a transcript, can I apply financial aid, can I do those basic functions, pay your employees, et cetera, et cetera. Now, and they never really had that concept of a relationship. They just had enough that I could send an email to you to say your bill's overdue or your transcript is ready for you or whatever the case may be. And then enter this system that's designed to kind of change the way you think about interacting with your students, of how do I improve the relationship that the institution or members of the staff of the institution, faculty, et cetera, have with the individual people, not just as a number and a person who has a balance due or that has a GPA of X, but as a person who has needs and we're responsible for addressing them. So I've always seen this like this pivot from the transactional to the relational, and an increase in these technologies that are enabling us to move out of, we've mastered transactional, that's so 20 years ago. Now let's master relational and then move on to what comes next, intellectual or whatever the case may be.
So thanks, Jeff. I think that was a good bookend to clarify that.